So good afternoon, everyone. My name is Tanya Verhulp, and I'm the Director of Executive Education here at the Haskayne School of Business. Thank you all for joining us today to spend some of your time over the lunch hour for the next session as part of our series Haskayne Connects. So thanks again to many of you who have come for the last two sessions, and welcome to everyone who's joining for the first time. So Haskayne Connects was created to help you navigate through these uncertain times with quick tips and ideas to move forward. We're hosting these sessions every week on a variety of topics, so continue to watch for upcoming invitations, and we hope that you'll continue to join us. We have a few opportunities scheduled today for you to ask questions and left a fair bit of time at the end to take as many as we can. So we ask that you save your questions till then. I'd like to welcome Beth Reimer-Heck now, who will be moderating our session today.
Tanya, it's a real pleasure to be here this afternoon and to moderate this session on the topic of financing during this time of COVID with our expert, Richard May. Welcome, Richard. So before we get started, let's talk about the format of the presentation today. We have 20 minutes for the presentation, followed by Q&A. Richard is going to lay out all the major points on the subject at the very beginning, and then we are going to look at a case study that will get the audience's active input on by having them comment in the chat box. So I'm making the audience aware right now this is a working session and we're looking forward to their involvement. So Richard, just to start off, what are the key points to keep in mind when considering financing for your business during COVID?
Thanks, Beth, and good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for coming. As you know, the topic of today's webinar is all about building a bridge with COVID financing, and specifically not building a pier. And really, when it comes right down to it, there's really one thing that I'd like you to take away from today's presentation. First of all, because we're here to talk about financing, we know that financing is a key element of recovery. That we already know. But where things start to get a little bit different is we start talking about the particular crisis that we're facing. We're hearing an awful lot of talk about how this is a crisis like no other, and I'm here to say that that absolutely is the case. And if you bring experience from your old crises, if you have them, you need to be very careful about how you use those, because making the wrong assumptions here and going with some unchallenged biases could end up leading not to success, but rather to failure. The key point, though, is the way to get through this unprecedented crisis with all of the unknowns that come along with it is to think like a startup. So today we're going to go through that process. I'm going to walk you through financing, why this crisis is different, and then show you how to think like a startup and how that's going to lead you to success.
Well, that is very pragmatic advice, Richard. So I'm wondering if we could see how that works in a case study of a local retailer. Do you want to lay that out for us?
Sure. Let's just use a business that we're all pretty familiar with, a local grocer, someone who's just, at the close, strip mall, local shopping center, who offers a variety of fresh fruits, vegetables, meats, dry goods, and so on and so forth. They are like many other retailers at the moment who are facing a dramatic change in how their businesses work. And what I'd like to do is, over the next little while, take you through what life is like for this local grocer.
Well, now would be then a good time to get the audience participation. And maybe we could do that by having them respond in the chat box at the bottom of their screens to this question about the local grocer. And the question would be, what should the owner of the retail shop be doing during this COVID crisis to manage through it? So if anyone who is out there, if they could please respond in the chat box about giving some ideas around what they think a local grocer should be doing during COVID. And we'll take, one suggestion per person would be great. And as it comes up, we can talk about it here.
Protect employees and customers. Yes, good start. Thank you, Stephanie.
So you want to start commenting on, oh yeah, there we go. And manage cash flow.
Yeah, CEWS, supply chain.
Yes, managing their supply chain, AHS regulations and cleaning, regular disinfection. got lots of different comments back. Understand customer needs. That's a new one. No one else has said that. Look at what else can be done to strengthen overall organization. And why not consider a case study related to business? Okay, who lost it? We could do that. We just thought this one was a very simple one. Balancing safety with accessibility.
Yep.
Any comments they want to make about any of these?
Yeah. Well, I'm seeing a lot of very, very good ideas, and it's clear, I think, that our audience already has some experience and some really good ideas in terms of dealing and what this local grocer might do. Michael, you raise a very good point about we could look at a local manufacturer. As Beth said, we chose a local grocer just because that was one that might be familiar to most people. But we could certainly talk about how things would be different for a manufacturer. And if there's more information you'd like afterwards, by all means, do follow up with us. But basically, if you're that local grocer, you are, of course, facing a crisis. And if I can just get there we go. You're in crisis management mode. And although this is a crisis that has no precedent, things that we don't know and things that we can't possibly foresee, fortunately, there's a framework for crisis management that allows us to systematically think about the things that we need to do. First and foremost, when it comes to crisis management, of course, we need to be thinking about our employees. They're the backbone of our company. Upon their shoulders, we serve customers and we manage to sustain our business. So first and foremost, we need to make our employees safe, healthy, and ready to contribute as best they can. So that means making sure that they look after their health, and making sure that if they've got some family issues, family members they need to support, young children at home, those kinds of things. To the extent possible, we try to allow for that, or even if we can, support people as they do that. Once we got our employees in a position where they're feeling a little bit stable and are able to contribute to the business moving forward, then we can move into how do we continue our business? How do we continue to serve customers? We obviously are doing some very new things now. And we've seen that as a local grocer. Certainly my experience has been that if I'm the local grocer, I'm first of all going to look at, can I continue to do business inside my physical location? And of course, some are and some are not. The ones that are moderating or monitoring the number of people in the store at the same time. They're maintaining social distancing. They, of course, have put in all kinds of processes and procedures to keep their employees and their customers safe. And somebody mentioned vendors as well. So you've got all of those basic protocols and processes in place. You've established some sort of a presence that allows you to serve customers going forward. And you've also figured out how you're going to collect money from your customers and be able to supply your vendors. So that starts to get the basic pieces in place. The next challenge after that, of course, is to recognize that you, as a local grocer, like most business owners these days, are facing a situation where your revenue is less than your costs. At least in the short term, you've got a situation where you need cash. And if your revenues and costs aren't an issue, you will have some problems potentially with working capital. In the case of a manufacturer, it may very well be that your customers are suffering and have got cash problems of their own. So as we're here to talk about financing, so let's talk about cash, because that's really what financing is all about. So before we get into the sources, of course, the question becomes, well, how much cash do we need? And for that, you'll put together a cash budget. You'll make your estimates. You'll you'll try and figure out how long this particular crisis is going to last. In other words, how long it will be before you return to some semblance of normalcy. You'll figure out, well, what sort of cash requirements do I have to meet? My suggestion, and a very strong one, would be to take whatever number you come up with and double it. Because experience has shown that most of us, when we make estimates about uncertain things ahead, especially with respect to cash, and I can tell you this as a venture capitalist, we tend to end up using twice as much cash as we think we do. So take whatever cash that you've decided you need, double it, and then start looking for people to help you with it. The first place to check, obviously, are grants, and there are lots and lots of them out there. Somebody mentioned the CEWS. That is one of many that are out there. The CEWS is the Canadian Emergency Wage Subsidy Program. It will provide you with 12 weeks of salary support for your employees, provided you meet certain requirements, such as experiencing a 30% reduction in revenue. I would encourage you, if you haven't looked at these programs, to look at them. we will provide you with a link at the end of the webinar where you can get more details. I can give you an outline, but by no means am I an expert on this, and I really encourage you to look at it. A second program is the Industrial Innovation Assistance Program. That one is a particularly interesting example because they went from announcing it to actually dispersing the money in about 4 weeks. So that's another thing that's changed with our COVID going forward, is that governments are moving far faster than we've ever seen in the past. And in the case of the IAP, the requirements are extremely light. You go to a website, you fill out a basic form, there's a quick follow-up, and within about 4 weeks, in fact, the applications for this is closed already, you are getting cash. Lots and lots of those out there. And it may very well be that once you look at the number of grants that are available to you, that you've got enough cash to get yourself through this crisis. Awesome. You're ready to move towards the next step. Most companies, however, are finding that the grants are kind of like an on-ramp to get you towards recovery, but by no means will you be able to get there in its entirety. Your next place to look, of course, is loans. Obvious first source will be your bank. However, because of your situation and that's changed dramatically, banks would look at you and not necessarily see you as being as creditworthy as you were in the past. And fortunately for you and for Canadian businesses, there's a wide variety of programs out there that are helping to expand the amount of credit that's available to you. So as I said, there's the bank, there's the Canadian Emergency Business Account that provides up to $40,000 in loans. There's the Business Credit Availability Program. And then there is the recently announced Large Enterprise, I think it's emergency funding or something or other. It came out so recently, I haven't had a chance to really study it. All of these are available to you, but the LEEFF, the LEAF program, is designed at very large companies, sort of up in the $300 million range. So there's a wide variety of loans available to you as a corporation. And then last but not least, of course, there is equity. If you're a small business and you're the owner, you may wish to contribute your personal funds. You may reach out to friends and family. If you're a larger enterprise, particularly one that has the potential to grow much larger or are large already, there are lots and lots of investors out there who may be willing to support your company going forward. In fact, we're at an unusual time in history in that there has never been as much available capital with investors for investment as right now. The trick, of course, is that you do need to meet their requirements. And the requirements, not surprisingly, have changed with COVID. They, as much as everybody else, are responding to what's happening with the situation. But regardless of whether it's a grant or a loan or equity, it's important to remember that as you get this cash, it isn't a one-way kind of transaction. It is an exchange, that the company is definitely getting cash, but in return, each of these funders are looking for some kind of a return. In the case of grants, we'll talk about that, but it has a lot to do with employment and sustaining your business. In the case of loans, these are still loans. They still need to be repaid, and there's some elements there that we really need to keep track of. And of course, equity investors also have expectations around returns. So once you've established your cash and you've got it in place, recognizing that you have those obligations, you now have your business continuity achieved. And what does that mean? It means your basic business is running. You're able to engage customers. It's different now. You're probably online. You're able to deliver value. It's different, but you're still providing the services, the products, and so on that you've done in the past, or maybe you're providing some new ones. And then finally, you're able to get paid. And so your basic business process is now up, and I would use the word walking or crawling or tottering or creaking or something, but nonetheless, you're finally in a situation where the business is back on its feet. And a lot of businesses are starting to find themselves in this situation as they go forward. Once you've done that, now you're able to think about recovery. Of course, the trick with recovery is, where does recovery go? And this was part of the question that we asked when we announced the webinar, because this is an unprecedented situation. We really have nothing to tell us about what's ahead. So is it going to be a pre-COVID? Are we going back to same old, same old? Is it going to be kind of like that? Or are we looking at something that is entirely different?
So Richard, it would be great right now if we got audience feedback on the poll results that we conduct, or that we're going to conduct. And the poll question was, how different will your business environment be post-COVID? And you see there's a listing there of a great deal, a lot, a moderate amount, a little, none at all. And we're asking everybody to respond. And how people respond here, I think, is going to really be telling or help shape what they see as the next steps in terms of what we speak about, in terms of their plans. So, and it's really interesting to see how these numbers are moving here. Any initial comments on them?
Well, it's interesting. I see that we have nobody saying none at all. And I hope that's not because I keep saying that it's like no other. If you honestly believe there will be no changes, please weigh in. It's important that you be honest here, but I do see most people thinking a lot. In fact, over roughly 60% of our respondents are saying either a lot or a great deal. So there we are. We're okay. So yes, roughly 2/3 of the audience are saying a lot to a great deal. So you're very much in the things are going to be dramatically different. And I would say, even if we think of this attitude or this question as being, you know, what happens if I'm wrong? I think, as we'll see, if you're thinking it's going to be a great deal and it turns out to be less than that, you're still in pretty good shape. On the other hand, if you were at the none at all, or potentially at the little stage, and it turns out to be a lot more than that, you could be making some presumptions and some assumptions that could dramatically reduce your chance of success going forward. So that's a great poll. I think you'll find that everybody, if you were to do a poll of you know, everybody in Calgary, you'd end up with a very similar kind of situation. It reflects as much the people themselves and their own view of what's ahead as the situation that they find themselves in. Some companies have been greatly afflicted and affected by this this particular problem. A lot have been much much less so. So depending on who you are and the kind of business that you're involved in, you're going to see this all a little bit differently. But I think regardless of what we see there, it's a big question mark. In fact, if you're the business owner or you're part of the team that's taking the business forward, this is what the business looks like to you right now. You might be able to see the next 10 feet. Maybe if you turn the headlights on, you can see a little bit further out there, but clearly this is a situation where you honestly don't know where you're going. And if you think of yourself, or if you think of financing rather, as a means to a lifeline, if you like, or as a bridge to recovery and future success, this is kind of like the bridge that you're building, in that you can see parts of it, but you really don't know where the bridge is actually going to end. And you don't know what is going to be on the other side when you finally do reach that solid ground again. For most Canadian companies, this is an entirely new situation. To be faced with this level of uncertainty or unknown for companies that have been functioning and been successful for decades, totally unprecedented. Fortunately, however, there are a few companies in Canada who deal with this every day, and we have an opportunity to learn from them. And the companies that I'm referring to are startups. So a startup, by definition, is a company that builds something that's never existed before. They then sell it to customers who didn't know that they needed it. And somehow, by doing those two things, they managed to make enough money to sustain their business and, in fact, reward the investors who supported them in those early days. Startups have been doing this for decades, and I'll be honest with you, I've been in this business for a long time. It took us a while before we got this right, but now we've pretty much figured out how you deal with these situations of almost complete unknown. And it really boils down to 3 letters, and the letters are BML. BML stands for build, measure, learn. And what happens then is when you're faced with an unknown, rather than studying it and analyzing it and investigating it, instead what you do is you actually interact with it. You start trying to figure stuff out, but figuring out through doing is the focus here. So you build something that allows you to interact with that uncertainty. It's a pilot, it's a trial balloon, it's a concept, it's a whatever. You talk to people, you get involved with various levels of customers, with suppliers, with whomever it is that you are experiencing the uncertainty. You build something, and as that interaction develops, you get results. Things start to happen. You then measure those. From the measurements, you then learn, and then you look at what you've learned and say, have I overcome this unknown? Have I overcome this uncertainty? If you have, then you have the insight you need to move your business ahead. If you haven't, absolutely nothing to worry about. What you do, though, is you take what you have learned and what you know now to be true that wasn't before you started the process, and you iterate. You build a second experiment and you go back in and you try it again. You go back and forth several times, as many times as you need to, but generally speaking, it's not that many before you finally get the insight that you need that allows you to move forward with your business.
Well, that's great in terms of looking at it from how we reduce uncertainty. When you had that picture, that was a great perspective of the bridge and where you want to go. And on this BML model, which is the build, measure, learn model, do you have a practical example maybe to give us of how a business could put this into practice, or how a business has put this into practice?
Yes, a great example. Now let's remember, we're the local grocery store here. We've been doing some sort of curbside service. We may have noticed that some of our customers have really remarked on how they actually enjoy or appreciate curbside service. And so we're starting to think that, gee, maybe this curbside thing isn't going to go away after COVID disappears. And so maybe there's an opportunity for me. So one way for me to find out would be to do something like this. And this is something that appeared on a chat feed probably about a week or so ago. As you can see here, if curbside 1.0 was what you're doing during COVID, this is curbside 2.0. And in this case, the curbside is your curb, or potentially the corner just down the road from your curb. And really what they're trying to do here is to bring the grocery store right out to their customers to make it more convenient, potentially more safe. I'm not a health expert, but this may be a way to achieve social distancing going forward. And who knows? And I don't know whether this is going to work. In fact, a lot of you are looking at this, and some of you may be saying, oh my God, I can't wait for this. And others are going, wait a minute. I mean, I have to be in my house. The answer is we don't really know for certain. This is an opportunity to explore. And so if I'm a local grocer, this is the kind of thing that I might be looking at. Now, this is a tractor trailer. I imagine that's probably, $500,000 worth of hardware there sitting on the wheels. So I might look at something a little bit more scaled down, but the whole point being is that I am going to try something new with my customers to see if I can continue to serve them in this new post-COVID world.
Well, that's a really interesting, innovative idea that could have come about because of the BML model. And so as a result of that kind of model that we just talked about, I'm wondering, what is the key to that model or that cycle? What makes it so that it's successful or could be successful, like this example here?
Great. Well, in addition to building and experimenting, there's a mindset shift that a lot of people need to be aware of, that they have to make. Okay, let's just go back. There's our BML process. We're starting with an unknown. Because it's unknown, we don't study it, we experiment with it. But if you take an unknown and you start experimenting with it, by definition, you are going to get results that you didn't expect. It just goes with the process. That in itself is a natural outcome of this particular process. The issue that you run into is that when you're in a corporate environment, unexpected results are problematic. They are mistakes. They are viewed as mistakes. They're considered mistakes. They need to be eliminated. If you miss your sales target, that's a mistake. Even if you miss because you're too high, it's because your forecasting is bad. If it's too low, it's because maybe you've got a sales problem, a quality problem, a pricing problem, who knows? In either way, it's a mistake that needs to be fixed. Now, corporations have used this process to be successful for decades. They understand it. They absolutely are very, very good at it. It is what allowed them to continue their successes, to eliminate these mistakes. The problem is that when you're in a situation with this level of unknown, if you treat unexpected results as mistakes to be avoided, you in fact put your entire company's security and future at stake. There are lots and lots of examples of where people who are absolutely certain, who could not tolerate mistakes going forward, went on to be unsuccessful. If you want a great one, would be Blockbuster. When people started going online, they didn't look at their reduction in sales as being something that needed to be fixed or to be propped up. They never ever looked at the possibility that there was going to be a complete shift in how their business was done. And there's lots and lots of examples out there. And with COVID, there will be a lot more. Instead, what you need to do is to take the startup mindset when you look at those unexpected results. They're keys to success. They're opportunities to learn. They're opportunities to find opportunities to serve customers that you didn't even know about, a chance to grow. They're to be encouraged. So for at least in the short term, until you're out of the COVID crisis. You need to think more in terms of a startup and less in terms of a corporation. You can change that post-COVID, but in the short term, this is your path to maximize your chance of success.
So having said all that on the mind shift, and having talked about what those results are, and having spoken about how the mindset shift is important, and the BML is important, can we now go back to financing and talk about that and see which different kinds of sources we have for financing?
By all means, absolutely. This webinar is all about financing. So remember, at the beginning of the webinar, we talked about finding the cash that you need, and here are your cash sources. And you'll recall that I said that although you're getting cash, it might even feel like a one-way transaction. In fact, it is an exchange. And so you've got the cash, now you're out of the crisis. Now is the time to complete the exchange, to honor the obligation that you've taken on. In the case of grant providers, it tends to be fairly light. They're looking for you to continue your commercial success and employ Canadians going forward. So that one's not so difficult to do. Some of the other ones, however, you need to be very, very mindful of. If a bank was a tiger during COVID, it has not changed its stripes. It is still a company that advances loans and whose business model is built on having those loans paid off. If your company is unable to pay off those loans, because instead of building a bridge to success, you've built a pier, you've left the bank in a very bad situation that they really have no choice but to actually bring those loans back in. And we all know how that happens, and it's not a very good story. And in fairness to the banks, they don't want to do that either. That's not fun for them. That's not something that they make money from. It's just that's what they have to do to sustain themselves as a business going forward. So there are obligations that you need to consider. And that's really what the point of all this was, is that I see a lot of companies reaching out for cash because cash is the lifeline. They lose sight of the fact that the cash is in fact an exchange. It's the first step. So regardless of whether you've gone to grants, loans, or equity, there's an exchange that needs to be honored, and you need to be thinking about that. And that's why figuring out how to get to be successful is how you honor those exchanges.
So then in terms of that follow-up on that description about a pier versus a bridge, do you have a way of kind of summarizing that up? I think a perspective on that.
Yeah. So let's go back to the problem that our companies are facing right now. They're trying to build this kind of bridge. They've loaded up on some cash. They've got their employees stabilized. They figured out kind of how to get their business running. Now they need to build this bridge over to the other side of whatever it is that they're facing, and then from there go to be successful going forward. So that's the nature of the challenge that they're facing. And the goal is to get to the other side of the bridge, not knowing exactly where that bridge is going, not knowing what the other side is even going to look like, but that's the situation that we're facing. So in summary then, we talked about financing is absolutely critical to recovery. That's the topic of this webinar. That's why we're all here. The important part to remember, however, is this truly is a crisis like no other, that there are the scale of the unknowns on the other side of this bridge, if you want to look at it that way, have no precedent. You know, we have companies now that used to have full offices that are now saying we are not going back to a full office. We are going to have maybe 20 to 30% of our employees working in the office, and everybody else is going to be working from home. That's a dramatic shift. If you're a landlord or people whose businesses depend on high office occupancy, you're now facing an existential change in your business. It is a crisis like no other. Fortunately for all of us, we have some examples of how we can reduce this uncertainty and go on to be success. And that's where we look and think to startups, that at least in the short term, thinking like a startup is going to maximize your chance of success.
Great, thank you, Richard. I think that leads us to the end of the presentation, and we're going to have some time for Q&A at this point. So if everyone who would like to have a question, if you could raise your hand in the participants menu, and Tanya will signal you by saying your name, and if you could just unmute your microphone at that time, say your name, ask the question, and if you could keep it short and to the point so that we can accommodate as many questions as possible. So Tanya.
Thank you, Beth. So again, if you want to ask a question, just go under the participants menu and you'll see a button to raise your hand. Click that and we'll call on you. But I see we do have one in the chat. So if you want to answer that, Richard, we'll start there. So any thoughts about innovation opportunities in highly regulated industries and industries requiring high reliability, safety, where innovation cycles have typically been much shorter than the startup space?
Geez, Erin, that is an excellent question. So if we think about some of those highly regulated industries, it may be open to discussion, but I would say that you know, the oil and gas industry, for example, is highly regulated. The health industry is highly regulated, and the innovation cycles have typically been slower. I think in that particular case, and if you're a supplier to that industry, it's good to have that in mind, but all of them are now facing seismic level changes. For example, I just happened to be reading the annual report, sorry, the quarterly report of an oil and gas company, and they were saying that through January to March of this year, although they suffered commodity price problems, in fact, they managed to move all of their operations, both in the office and in the field, to a virtual state. Obviously, people were still in both places, but they had gone almost completely virtually without actually making any significant change to operations. In other words, they were able to keep their business going with far fewer people physically present in the office. So that is an example of a regulated industry that has actually been able to respond to this crisis by making some significant changes. So the simple answer to this is you've got to engage with them. You'll have to get out there and talk to them and start building stuff, measuring and learning. Certain elements of their business may be highly regulated and therefore potentially resistant to change, but other things are going to change quickly. I know I've been speaking with a few doctors that have now been, of course, doing remote visits with their patients. And in the past, they've resisted that. They didn't like doing it. Now, a lot of them are saying, you know what, I like that. It's more convenient. I can, there's lots of good things to do about it. So I'm still within the regulatory envelope, but I'm operating differently.
Great, thank you. So I don't know your first name, but Kay has their hand up if you want to go ahead.
Yeah, I found it interesting when you were talking about the mindset shift. So basically what you're advocating there is essentially moving to a continuous improvement process on an ongoing basis and getting away from punitive approaches. Am I interpreting that correctly?
Yeah, great question. Yes, there is a lot of what is known as continuous improvement in this kind of thing. A lot of it depends on how you actually run the continuous improvement process. I've seen CI processes run in two directions. One is they do continue to do that mistake elimination process that we've identified, you know, a cost or a problem, and we are going to CI that out of the system. The other way to run a CI is to run it as an explorative process that says, gee, what if we did something very differently? Would that have an impact? So there's more of an experimental, divergent approach as opposed to a convergent one. But as long as you have the mindset that unexpected results are opportunities to learn and improve, you can take it in either direction. I would suggest that divergent is probably a better way to go these days, given the uncertainty, because you just are expanding the space in which you're looking for success.
Thanks.
We have another question in the chat. So what advice would you give to someone seeking a grant for app development?
Okay, another very good question. So I'm going to put my venture capitalist hat on in this particular place. If you're seeking a grant for application development, there are lots and lots of government organizations that are focused, on facilitating and supporting and enhancing innovation. If you want to share your email with us afterwards, I'll send you a link to all of the various organizations that are out there. There is a large number of them. The Industrial Research Assistance Program is one. Alberta Innovates has a number of supports. It's called Platform now. Western Economic Development. There's a large number of government organizations who are out there with grants, and provided, of course, you meet their criteria, they're there to support you. So just send us an email and we'll follow up with you.
Great. We don't have have anybody else with their hand raised or questions in the chat. But maybe I'll ask a couple that came in advance when people registered. So what is the anticipated deadline of the CERB subsidy program?
I don't have the exact answer for that because I'm not a CERP employee. Again, we can direct you to that particular website to give you the full details. I have heard that it's 16 weeks. In other words, that's the length of the overall support program, but I'm not clear on the details of when it starts and when it ends. I think it's no surprise to hear or to admit that they are looking at changing some of the deadlines and some of the eligibility and support periods as we go along. So it's much better that we provide you with a link with the exact details than for us to provide information that might not be accurate. Oh, thank you, Anka. We'll get you a response for that.
Great. So it looks like Tom has asked a question. Any advice on how to manage accounts receivable in the current environment?
Yeah, because that's one of your major sources of cash. And I think what you're referring to there, Tom, and I'm guessing, but I think it's pretty straightforward. You're always trying to balance. You want to obviously collect that cash. You also want to maintain that customer relationship going forward because, you know, this business will go on post-COVID and you're trying to find that balance. I think there's a couple pieces of advice that I would offer. One is, of course, would be to make certain you know of what your legal rights are. That's not that you intend to exert them or apply them, but rather at least you know sort of what your sort of last options are. But then most importantly is to engage in a dialogue with your customers that have those accounts receivable. They will find themselves in a situation that's very similar to you. They want to honor those obligations, but they, much like you, may find themselves in a situation where they can't. And the only way to find your way through that is to somehow talk your way and negotiate your way through. That's, in my experience, that's always been the best. It's not easy, but I can tell you that if you try to pursue the legal and the more, the statutory remedies that you have, that's not easier either, and you will certainly lose customers. And I'm not sure that you get a better chance of success. I think I'd want to, Beth, maybe you can weigh in on that because there are some legal elements to this, but I've always found that talking and negotiating is usually your best first strategy.
Yeah, I think you're exactly right, Richard, in terms of you don't want to pursue a legal remedy right off the bat. I honestly do believe that any good customer relations is based on a relationship and by speaking to your customers. I have noticed, and I'm sure there's other people out there that have noticed this as well, that it depends on the kind of business, but some are putting it forward so before you get the service, you make the payment, or it's done exactly at the same time. And there's kind of an expectation around that. So you can think about those ways. Think about ways in which of how did you do it previously in terms of payment, and does it make sense right now to switch that up given the environment? A lot of people understand the need that people need to have to get paid, and that they have bills that they have, and they've got their business they want to continue to run. So that would be my comments. And I also agree that on the last thing you want to be doing is be going to a lawyer to be able to enforce on it, because once it's like that, it's really tough to collect on it unless it's something that is absolutely, it's a larger piece of equipment that is key. But on those kinds of things, I do think about the fact that you change up your way that payment is made.
Great point. Yep, we are all in this together. Absolutely. Absolutely.
So there's no more questions in the chat or with no hands raised, but there was some questions in advance around rent, leasing, and how that could be impacted by some of these grants and loans. Do you want to comment on that at all, Richard?
I'm sorry, I had a bit of an audio problem there. Would you mind repeating that? Sorry.
Oh, sure. Okay. So there was some specific questions in advance around rent, landlords, leasing situations. I won't ask the specific questions, but if you want to comment at all on that.
Yes, absolutely. There is the CECRA, I believe it is, and again, I'm not up on all of these acronyms, but it is basically a program that that helps small businesses, small and medium-sized enterprises address their lease and rental obligations to landlords. It is available on the website in the link that we will send you afterwards. But it absolutely is a critical part of this. Again, there's such a domino effect with pretty much every situation that we've looked at so far that if this is almost like the other side of the accounts receivable question that we got earlier, that now we have landlords that are dependent on tenants to make their payments, and it's very easy to think, well, they've got tons and tons of money, and maybe some of them do, but at the end of the day, they have obligations as well. And fortunately for our government, they've actually put some of those programs in place, and that would be the first place to look. Great.
Again, there was a question in advance around PPE and getting where do I get support and source some PPE for my business? Do you have any advice?
Yes, if you want to send us your email afterwards, we'll be happy to follow up with you. I haven't had to look for PPE personally, but I would imagine that most suppliers, and they are pretty well known, obviously, and I won't mention any names, but you can certainly use Google or other methods to find them on the web. If they're having problems with supply, it's because their supply chain itself is struggling. I mean, if you're looking for N95 masks, I know that it's a bit touch and go with those. Sanitizer, some of the other elements of COVID preparedness are hard to find. So if you're struggling and your traditional sources of supply are not on a sustained basis, aren't able to support you, send us an email and we'll be happy to reach out and see who else we might be able to connect you with.
Richard, I have a final question for you, seeing as there isn't another one up. Well, I actually see one here. Do you want to do that one, Tanya?
Sure, yeah. So are there any sources that you trust and rely on for predicting the effects of this situation?
Are there any sources that you trust in predicting?
I mean, I interpret that as, there's a lot of information out there right now. How do we know what to trust?
Yeah. Gee, that's a really good question. I think, I guess perhaps the first response I would make to that is people who are making predictions about the future can be very, very smart and very, very capable and have tons and tons of data at their fingertips and still be wrong. In fact, one of the reasons that our economy acts the way it is because nobody has been able to accurately predict the future in any shape or form on a sustained basis. So when I look at predicting the effects of the situation, that's almost like a second order a problem again. In other words, since we're not able to predict where the future is going to be, and we can't predict what the side effects will be either. So at this particular point, if I was a startup, and there's a common refrain that we share, and I hope no one's offended by this, but in the startup world, what you say is, "In God we trust, all others bring data." And what that really means is that you can listen to all kinds of different sources of data, of future predictions, but at the end of the day, the only thing that you can really rely on is data that you've captured and understood yourself and have validated in the market by engaging with it. So that takes us kind of right back to the BML loop. So my first thought would be is if there's a critical unknown that you face in your business, and I'm assuming this is the case, how can you test and find out more about it? How can you learn about it? And studying it, listening to experts, and so on, investigating, those are all ways of kind of getting a handle on it, but the unknowns level is so high, you're far better off to experiment and just dig in. And if you want more information, again, please follow up with us.
Okay, so maybe I can jump in with one last question and then we can wrap up. So my question to you, Richard, is just around on the different sources of resources that are available to a small business. And I've had this question asked to me by clients, etc., is that if you are looking for applying for a grant, is there instances if you're a small company that's doing fine that you should or should not take advantage of those grants?
So again, I'm just going to play it back to you, Beth, so I'm clear on this. So this is a situation where the company to this point has managed to do well, but is looking at the future ahead and saying, things may change here. In fact, I think they're likely to change. How do I mitigate that risk? In other words, and can I reach out and get some of these grants? Is that really what the question is?
Or should they?
Or should they?
Or should they? Because you made the very good point of saying the difference on a loan side, you have to repay it. Think about it that way. You're building a bridge. So my question is around specifically on the grants. Is there the same consideration? Should you be thinking about it in the same way?
Well, I guess if I put myself in the business owner's shoes, I would look at it I would take the exchange view of that decision. In other words, first of all, I'm going to assume that I'm eligible for those grants. And by the way, the eligibility requirements are pretty good at trying to identify and select companies that really do have considerable need for these kinds of support. So I'm going to assume that you're in that category and that you are eligible. But like any other financing, this is an exchange, and what you're getting is some cash, and in exchange for that, you're incurring some obligations that you need to honor. In this particular case, the obligations may end up being relatively light, and that you have to sustain employment, as we've discussed. The cash that you have may end up being something that allows you to better experiment going forward. So there may be some advantage increasing your chance of success by having that cash that allows you to take on some uncertainty that you otherwise could not. So all things being equal, assuming that that you're eligible for the grant and that it's a bona fide application, all of those kinds of things, and you look at the requirements, the exchange that takes place, if you on balance think that is going to increase your chance of success, I would say go and do it.
That's great. Well, thank you very much for that. I noticed there is one more question, and for those that have asked a question, we can look at responding directly to you after the session and getting back to you. And I want to say thank you very much, Richard, for your excellent presentation today. Really enjoyable and insightful in terms of building a bridge. I think your message was really well received instead of just a pier, and now we understand what you're meaning by that. And also thank you to Lauren Falkenberg and to Tanya Verhelp and Patrick Ney and Janelle Morris for all their help here today for making this possible. And just a reminder that next week we're here again at noon on the topic of apples and oranges, structured creativity to innovate your firm's revenue streams, and that's going to be presented by Davidson. And lastly, I'd like to say thank you to all of you for coming and participating with us today.
Thank you all.
Thank you.
Have a great day and be well.